All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Midrash on the Parashah with Rabbi Dr. Lebens. By now, you should know the drill, so I think we can just jump in. So, Dr. Lebens, over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I've just shared a handout for those interested in a handout. Okay, and we'll begin. Parashat Hashavuah, exciting. Okay, so it's well known that the opening of our Parashah has this peculiar locution. It numbers the years of the life of Sarah Imenu, in a peculiar way. Instead of saying that she lived to be 127 years old, it says that she lived to be 100 years and 20 years and 7 years. And this sometimes happens. Sometimes when the Torah gives a number, it goes in units, tens and hundreds, and sometimes it goes in hundreds, tens and units. It is the rarer of the locutions, but it's not the only time it happens. But you won't be surprised to hear that the midrashim have a field day on that, and there's a well-known Rashi that quotes the midrash on that, wanting to compare how she was in various respects at the years of 100 with how she was in various respects when she was 20 years old, with how she was in various other respects when she was 7 years old. Later on, in this week's Parashah, the narrative also relates to the age of Abraham. It says, for Abraham Zakein, this is Genesis 24, verse 1. Abraham Zakein, ba b'yamim, v'Hashem beirach et Abraham bakol. Abraham was old. Now it's difficult to translate ba b'yamim. I'll come back to it. Abraham was old. He was ba b'yamim, and God blessed him in every respect. By the way, there's a very beautiful midrash that we're not going to look at this week on this verse, a quite well-known midrash. The rabbis debate how can the verse say that Abraham was blessed in every respect, since we're never told that he had a daughter. And how can you be said that you're blessed in all respects if you don't have a daughter? And one side, predictably, of the debate says, well, actually, especially in the ancient Near East, having a daughter wasn't so easy. There were risks associated and liabilities associated with having a daughter. But the other side of the debate says, no, of course he had a daughter. The verse couldn't have said that he was blessed in all respects if he didn't have a daughter. It says, V'Hashem beirach et Abraham bakol, in all respects. And the Midrash suggests that her name, the name of Abraham's daughter, was Bakol, which is a nice Midrash. There's something of a silly joke about that Midrash. There's a peculiar idea. I mean, it's based in the verses, of course. We see that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as well as in particular Rebecca, of the foremothers, were anxious that their children shouldn't marry outside of the family, basically the family of Terach, the ancestor, the father of Abraham. And in order to extend that idea that there was some sort of taboo about marrying beyond that family, the Midrash suggests that all 11 of the sons born to Jacob were born with a twin sister, and each son married one of their sisters, which, I mean, is very disturbing because that's incest and it's forbidden in biblical law. But there's a kind of a funny joke, which is that, if they were allowed to marry their sisters, and Abraham, we know, was very eager in this week's Parashah to make sure that Yitzchak received a Jewish wife, why didn't he just marry Bakol? And the answer to that is because you can't marry a midrash. So that is a well-known midrash and a well-known joke, but we're not going to look at it today. Okay, I wanted to look at the age of Abraham, and I want to look at this phrase for a moment, Ba b'yamim. What does it mean? Right? in a creative flourish, the King James translation tells us that Abraham was well stricken in age. But I mean, that's just not what it means. That's not what the phrase means. So I suppose he's trying to, the King James's translation is trying to translate it idiomatically. It sees it as an idiom and it tries to kind of find a suitable English idiom. Robert Young was characteristically closer to the literal meaning, but further away from making any sense in his translation. He says that Abraham hath entered into days, because the word ba, it literally means to draw near or to enter, and bayamim means with or into days. So perhaps the idea is, and this is how JPS translates it in the 1985 JPS translation, Abraham was advanced in years. I think people sometimes translate it as comely of days, if you want another idiomatic translation of Baba Yamim, comely of days. The thing is, of course, Abraham was advanced in years, right? It's just told us he was old. So it says, Abraham Zakein Baba Yamim, Abraham was old, advanced in years. So it ends up being superfluous. The phrase doesn't add anything. And the phrase has occurred once before in the Torah, in a description of Abraham and Sarah, when they received the news that they're to conceive. We're told that they were old. This is in last week's Parashah. And again, that they collectively had come into days. That's Genesis 18:11. So the first source on your handout is the commentary of Nachmanides to that verse over there in last week's Parashah, when it describes Abraham and Sarah as Babi Yamim. He says, Ha'adam b'imei b'churotav, a person in his youth, yikra omed b'yamim, he's described as standing in days. Vayikra yamav, sometimes vayikra yamav, his days are sometimes called his days. Kihem shelo, because the days in which he's standing, they're his. He's come of age. He's living in, we talk about his life and times, right? The times, in a sense, belong to him when he's in the prime of his life. Kilashon et mispa yamecha amaleh. In the book of Exodus, chapter 23, it says that the number of your days I will fulfill, right? I'll let you live out the days of your life, your days. Aval, ka'asher yizakin v'yichyeh yamim rabim, merov b'nei ha'adam b'dorah. When a person gets old and he's lived many days, and more days than the majority of people around, yikra babi yamim. It says he's come into days. Mipnei shehu kababa eretz acheret. It's like he's come into a different land. He's no longer living in his generation because, so to speak, he's outlived the other members of his generation. He's living already in the days of others, so to speak. Like noser me'ir uba el ir miyom el yom, like a person who travels from city to city, from day to day. He's never really at home. So it's like, yeah, so it's like it's a nice translation of Babi Yamim, and it creates this kind of image of the days of an elderly person being like a stranger entering a new town, because she's come into days that aren't somehow hers. She's alienated from the age in which she finds herself. Right? So like, it's as if by the time that Avram and Sarah were blessed with the news of Yitzchak's arrival, it's like on the Ramban's reading of the verses, it's like they were already relics from a bygone age. They were no longer standing in their own days. So it's a quite negative read. So I wanted to share with you a more positive reading from the Zohar. The Zohar says, and the Zohar, what exactly the Zohar is, when exactly it was written, when exactly it was redacted, who exactly did what in the process of writing and redacting is a fraught and academic topic that we're not going to get into. But it certainly has a midrashic style. Whether it's authentic or whether it's later is really to my mind neither here nor there. I treat a lot of the Zohar as midrash, and it says Tachazi, come and see. Avraham de Zachar, regarding Abraham who was meritorious. Makativ, what does it say about him? And this is from this week's Parashah. Babi Yamim, he had come into days. Mishum de Zachar, it's a way of speaking about a person who was virtuous, right? So it says that because he was virtuous. Why? Kad istalek mahai alma, when he departed from this world, be'inun yomin mamash delay, he literally entered into his own days. A'al ve'it labash bahu, he got up and he got dressed in them as if he was wearing his days like a garment. Velo gara levush yakar klum, there was absolutely nothing missing from this precious garment that he was wearing. Dichtiv, as it says, Babi Yamim, he came, so to speak, with his days or in his days. He wore his days as a garment. And the Zohar contrasts this perhaps unfairly with Eov, Makativ. What does it say regarding Job? Vayomer arom yatsati mibet enimi va'arom ashuv shama. I came into this world naked from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return unto there. Daha la ishta'el levusha labasha be, because in this case there was no clothing left for him to wear. It's a little bit obscure, but the positive idea here is that Abraham had accrued such merit, right, that every single one of his days was like a badge of honor. I think most of us, I don't want to speak for anyone but myself, but I imagine that most of us, when we come before our Maker, please God, we should all have a long time before that happens. We'll be called upon to give an account of ourselves and our lives, and I imagine we'll be eager to present our achievements, but there are probably some things we'd want to gloss over. There are certain days that that were wasted or misspent. Perhaps we'll kind of, as we give an accounting of our lives, we'd kind of wish to gloss them over. But Abraham and Sarah, by contrast, we're told they came with their days, and in the Zoharic reading of that, it means that every one of their days was something that they could present to their Maker with pride. Every one of their days was like a badge of honor. Okay. All of that was by way of introduction to the Midrash we're going to look at. Oh, no problem, Jennifer, thank you. So last week I mentioned that the first time that a word appears in the Tanakh, the rabbis take it to be of a deep significance. They take the first appearance of a word to be introducing an archetype. And this week we find a midrash. It's going to be the midrash that we focus on this week. That relates to Abraham's distinction as the first individual to be singled out for his age. Now it's a little bit dochak, a little bit forced, because actually we've just said that Sarah was described as old in last week's Parashah, but she's never described as being old on her own, but only alongside Abraham. It was in the plural. They were old. They had come into their age, right? Abraham is the first individual to be described alone as old. And the Midrash wants to argue, unsurprisingly, since it's the first instance of a word, that Abraham's old age carried a profound significance and teaches us something about what age is or what age could be. So we can look at the Midrash. Oh, there was something I wanted to share with you. I only thought about this on Shabbat. We spoke about last week the vivid juxtaposition of the open tent of Abraham and the tent of Lot in Sodom that has its doors. And we spoke all about openings and doors. But I didn't realize until this week, or I'd never paid sufficient attention until this week, that the Haftarah that we read in Shul about the life and work of Elisha the prophet is a Haftarah that is also distinguished by the appearance of doors. And indeed, it may have been one of the multiple reasons why the Haftarah itself was even chosen. Because whenever Elisha does certain types of miracles in last week's Haftarah, he always closes the door first. So he uses the door for privacy or for a type of modesty. And I thought it was an interesting further observation to look at, that the doors of Elisha are better, so to speak, than the doors of Lot. There are some times where it's appropriate to have a door, not to shut people out, but to create a sense of privacy, not to show off when you're doing a miracle, something like that. Anyway, I digress. Back to this week's Parashah and our investigation of the age of Abraham. We have the Midrash on the handout. It's from Parashah Rabbah 65:9, and it says as follows. Amar Rabbi Yehuda bar Simon, Avraham tava zikna. Abraham requested old age. Amar lefanav, Ribono olamim, Adam uvno nichnasin lemakom. Abraham said, Master of the universe, a man and his son, they enter into a place. But ein Adam yodeya lemi mechabed. Nobody knows to whom honor should be given, because they can never tell the son apart from the father or the father apart from the son. No one knows which one is older. But if you would crown a person with signs of old age, so to speak, then people will know unto whom honor should be given. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, chayecha davar tov tavata. God says, the Holy One, blessed be He, says to Abraham, wow, by your life, you have claimed an interesting thing, a good thing. Umimcha humatchil. It's going to start from you. Mitchilata sefer v'yad kan, from the beginning of the book until now, inktiv zikna. Age hasn't been mentioned. And like I said, that's not exactly true, because age had been mentioned in conjunction with Sarah, but that was about Sarah and Abraham collectively. It never been mentioned about a single person. The kivan sha'amad Abraham, but from the moment that Abraham stood up, Natan la zikna, God gave to him, I suppose it means the outward signs of old age. How do we know? Because it says in this week's Parashah, in chapter 24, verse 1, Abraham Zakein, Yamim, the verse that we've been looking at. And I find this midrash somewhat comical. I don't even know quite where to begin. Right? So are we to believe that before Abraham, right, nobody ever showed any sign of aging? Right? So did they finish puberty and then just remain in their biological prime until they drop dead? Right? Did Methuselah, who lived to the grand old age of 969, are we to imagine that he just looked like a 20-something-year-old when he died? Right? And then we're supposed to believe that Abraham, right, this righteous man, who was deserving of honor, right? But are we to believe that he would really have sought this honor out? It's like he's presented as being upset that people don't know who to honor, him or his son, because they look so similar. Right? That doesn't seem characteristic of a righteous personality. Right? That he would have begrudged somebody honoring his son instead. But yes, it seems, if we want to process this midrash, at least on the surface, we have to imagine that Abraham wanted this and that nobody had it before him. I mean, we'll come back to a deeper reading later on. I'm going to look at this comment from Jennifer. with this exploration of age as our topic, she would like to mention the movie Mrs. Palfrey at the Claremont with Joan Plowright. Best movie I've seen in a long time. It's got to do with dimensions of growing old. Fascinating. Okay, I'll make sure I put it on my list. Okay. So, as I said, in actual fact, old age was mentioned before our Parashah, and it was mentioned last week. I'm suggesting we overlook that little detail because, like I've said, it's the first time that the word appears in order to single out an individual. But even so, right, this midrash is very difficult to swallow. Right? So we all have to reconcile ourselves to the physical effects of aging, right? Or we have to invest in anti-wrinkle cream, Botox, facelifts, whatever it may be. And even then, it's a losing game. Right? It's a fool's errand. But apparently, all of this is Abraham's fault, right? We should blame Abraham because until Abraham, nobody had asked for it, and God hadn't even thought of it. And then when Abraham did it, God was, "Oh, what a good idea! Okay, well, I'll create signs of aging." But the midrash isn't finished. The midrash continues, and it says, "Let's look at the Hebrew. Where was I? Yitzchak hava yisurim. Isaac requested suffering, and in context, what this means is he required he requested something like the sufferings of old age. I'll explain what I mean in a minute, but like the frailties of old age. What's the story? Well, it says, he said to God, "Look, Master of the universe, Adam met below Yisurim. If a person dies without having had any suffering in this world, midat hadin metuchak negdo, the attribute of divine justice will kind of bend over him because he's worthy of punishment in the world to come." So Isaac says, well, mitoch sha'ata mevi alav yisurin, but if you would just kind of ration out some suffering to us in this life, perhaps through the frailty of old age, then midat hadin will be less angry with us. The attribute of strict justice will be less angry with us when we pass away, and perhaps we'll have a nicer afterlife, right? So if you bring us Yisurin in this life, you bring us the sufferings of old age in this life, ein midat hadin metuchak negdo. The divine attributes of strict justice won't bend over us. Amalek Baruch Hu, God said, chayecha davar tov tavata umimcha ani matchil. What a good idea. I'd never thought of like old age frailty. That wasn't part of the design plan. But since you've raised it, we'll start with you. Mitkanata sefer v'yad kan, from the beginning of the book until now, ein ketiv yisurin, there's no mention of frailty or the suffering of old age. That's not really what the word Yisurin means. Yisurin just means suffering, but it's clear from context, as you'll see, that it's talking about the suffering of old age. But Kevan Shamad Yitzchak Natan Lo Yisurin, from the moment that Isaac emerged, he was given Yisurin. How do we know? Because it says in next week's Parashah, Vayehi ki zaken Yitzchak vatichachena et einav, or something like that. It says when Isaac got old, his eyes weakened. He had some sort of age related ophthalmic condition. I suggest perhaps it was macular degeneration or something. But this is something that affects the elderly. Problems with seeing, and it first happened with Yitzchak, and it happened because he asked for it, according to the Midrash. Okay. We're not finished. Yaakov tava et tacholi, right? Jacob requested, and you'll see from the context what it really means. It means terminal illness. Jacob requested terminal illness. Amar lefanav ribono olamin. Jacob said, Master of the universe, Adam met below choli. A person just dies without being ill. Just suddenly, one night, you die. You live like Metef Shelach to 969 years old, and you go to bed one night, you don't wake up, and there was no sign. You didn't look old. You suffered no frailty, and there was no kind of warning that death was coming near. And because of that, we always like to put off to tomorrow what really we should be doing today. And one of the things we should be doing today is creating peace and orderliness among our offspring. But, we leave it till too late. When do you write that last will and testament? And when do you put your estate in order? Well, Jacob says, you give us no warning about when we're going to die. So we put it off until too late. But if you would allow the elderly, so to speak, to get sick for a day or two before they pass away, it would be something like a signal to them that they're going to die. And he'd be able to make peace among his children. He'd be able to sort things out, in terms of what should be among his inheritors. The Holy One, blessed be He, said to him, we see the pattern. I'd never thought of such a thing. Terminal illness, what a wonderful idea. And from you it shall begin. How do we know? Because it says in the book of Parashah, this is in a few weeks' time, it's in Parashat Vayechi, the last Parashah of the book of Genesis. It says, Vayom El Yosef, Hinei avicha choleh. It says to, that's a very nice point, Alana. It's interesting that Yitzchak should request suffering as if he hadn't suffered, right? Because the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, must have been a terrible trauma. But, okay, you're right, and it's definitely noteworthy. Although I would translate the Midrash as partially in order to neutralize that concern with the Midrash, I would translate Yisurin in context as the Yisurin of old age. But you're right, it's not like Yitzchak needed it. He'd had plenty of trauma in his life. Maybe he meant it for other people, and God said, good idea, I'll start from you, right? But certainly a very fine point to raise. So we see in the life of Jacob that we're told that Jacob was ill and his days were drawing to a close. Jacob is the first person of whom this kind of process is described. So the Midrash imagines that he had asked for this. Okay? And then Rabbi Levi comes in to summarize, to add insult to injury, just to make this sound like the most bizarre Midrash ever. Rabbi Levi comes and summarizes, and he summarizes thusly. Amar Rabbi Levi. Rabbi Levi said, Avraham chidesh zikna. Avraham innovated old age. Yitzchak chidesh yisurim. Isaac innovated the frailty of old age. Yaakov chidesh choli. Jacob innovated terminal illness. And you're thinking like, well, thanks, guys. This is really quite horrible. What to make of it? So you could certainly walk away from this midrash with some very dispiriting conclusions. Right? First, the rabbis were so naive as to think that there was simply no aging before Abraham, and no frailty before Yitzchak, and no illness before Jacob, just because the Bible doesn't explicitly mention those concepts before the story of those people. So you could walk away here thinking that the rabbis just were very, very naive. And secondly, I think much more poignantly, perhaps, our Midrash coldly celebrates the way in which these three people, according to the story of the Midrash, brought untold suffering upon themselves and upon the rest of humanity. But what I want to suggest is we shouldn't read the Midrash that way. The authors of the Midrash were tremendously creative, and yet some people who read the Midrash are not all that creative. You know, we read the book of Genesis, and you see the world was created in 6 days, and there was a talking snake, and there was this and this, and the literally minded among us, think that the book of Genesis was supposed to be some natural history book, and therefore when faced with the archaeological records and and contemporary cosmology, they're put into some sort of crisis of faith. But just look at the book of Genesis. It's not written in the style of a natural history. It's a completely different genre. It's just, you're missing the point of the book which Rashi says explicitly. You're missing the point of the book if you're looking to it for science lessons or an accurate natural history. This has no bearing, of course, on the provenance of the book, on its divinity. If God writes a book, you should still ask him, okay, thanks God, where should I put it in the library? What genre is it? Right? And if it's a novel, you don't make conclusions about natural history based on the back of it. Well, so too with Midrash. We have to try and understand, what Midrash is. You could read the Midrash says, oh, the rabbis believe that nobody got old before Abraham. Oh, the rabbis believe nobody got ill before Jacob. But that again depends on what genre this type of writing is. And my suggestion is, in general, that we look at Midrash, and especially the narrative midrashim that I'm mainly sharing in this course. We look at them as prose poetry, and therefore they're inviting us to unpack them. Right? Chayecha, by your life, God says. What a great idea! Like, as if these concepts were completely new. Right? I think it's hard to read this without seeing a sense of humor, right? And nonetheless, so first we have to be a very humorless person, I think, not to see the sense of humor in the Midrash. But also, when you find a funny Midrash, you're also invited to find the serious point beneath the humor. It's also not a comedy book. So here's my suggestion. It's not rocket science, but I found it. It's not that Abraham truly initiated or requested the signs of aging. Right? There were people who showed signs of aging before him. Of course there were. Right? And the idea that he should have asked for it is almost ludicrous. Instead, what the rabbis might be suggesting with this kind of pastiche is that he was the first old person truly to deserve the honor that's given to the elderly. Right? Remember, according to the Zohar, he hadn't wasted a single day. Babi Yamim. It's not merely that he'd lived a long time, but like Sarah, his wife, and his partner in founding the Jewish people, what we should really take from Abraham, we're saying this is a person like Sarah. The two of them had never wasted a day. And in that context, you think, he was wearing his age in a new way. He and Sarah were the first people, perhaps, to use their life without wasting a moment. Everywhere he went, he brought all of his days with him. You could read it this way. Instead of the Zohar, he brought all his days with him to the pearly gates. His wrinkles were the battle scars of a life well lived. In other words, he gave new meaning to the signs of age. God had no need to mention age in his book before Abraham and Sarah. And that's what it means when Rabbi Levi says he was an innovator. Right? It's not there was no age before him. It's kind of almost like a comic frame for a really profound point about Abraham, the innovator of elderliness. We all spend so long, I shouldn't speak for anyone else but me, but I look in the mirrors as more and more of my hairs are going grey, and we notice signs of aging, as if that's something we should be ashamed of. But I suppose Abraham's saying, on the contrary, or Abraham's life is teaching us, on the contrary, if one has lived one's life well, then every single wrinkle is something of which to be proud. Pain and suffering, they are brute facts of human existence, of physical existence. And, you know, if I was to put my hat on as an academic philosopher, we know that the problem of evil is the biggest philosophical and existential challenge to face the theist. And, you know, I would never judge a person who loses faith in the face of great suffering. You know, there's no doubt that suffering can be crippling to a person's faith. But on the other hand, there are people, and there have been people, who are able to relate to their suffering somehow as an opportunity for spiritual growth, ethical growth. They relate to it. They relate to their pain and suffering as something that could perhaps cleanse them or refine them or reconcile them to their mortality, or, you know, they could hear in their own suffering perhaps a call to contemplation. For those people, they may be few and far between, and I don't judge anyone who doesn't fit this description. But for those people, suffering can somehow be invested with religious significance. And as Rabbi Levi would put it, Yitzchak was an innovator because he was the first to invest such significance into his own frailty. And, you know, you're right, I can't remember who it was. Let me look back at the chat. Lana Lubin had mentioned that Yitzchak had suffered before he got old in the Akedah too. So read this way: Yitzchak was an innovator in that he related to his suffering as something like an opportunity for spiritual growth, as a call to contemplation, etc. Finally, in the Midrash, I don't want to say that Jacob, God forbid, requested that God invent terminal illness. A terrible thing to say, right? It wasn't the case that before Jacob, people were just permanently healthy until their sudden deaths, right? That's just the conceit of the Midrash, the somewhat dark but humorous conceit of the Midrash. But this is the lesson. Jacob related to his own terminal illness, and we see this explicitly in the text, right? This we don't have to, you know, and this isn't in this week's Parashah, it's in the final Parashah of the book of Genesis. But, you know, with the frailty of Isaac and the age of Abraham, there has to be a lot of kind of creative reading, filling in the gaps. We're assuming that Abraham wore his signs of age, like the battle scars of a life well lived. We're assuming that Isaac related to his frailty as he grew old as an opportunity for something like spiritual cleansing. But there's no direct evidence for that in the text, other than these are the first people to be, you know, to have these things mentioned alongside them as individuals. But with Jacob, it's very explicit in Parashat Vayechi. He did relate to his terminal illness as an opportunity, because what he did at that time was to try to set things straight with his family. He called together all his children and he used it as an opportunity. He didn't celebrate his suffering, but he did find a use for it, right? So there were two more contemporary sources I wanted to share with you. They're on the handout. Just pick them up now. Excuse me, just pulling it up. Yes. The first one is actually the last on the handout, but well, no, I'll do it in the order of the handout. This idea that Abraham used every single day, and that's what Baba Yamim means. There wasn't a day wasted. That in the language of the Zohar, he wore his days, each and every one of them, as he came before his Maker in the world to come. And in the idiom, I suppose, of the Midrash, as I'm reading it, he wore those days as he wore his wrinkles as battle scars of a life well lived, because not a moment was wasted. Today is the Yortzeit of, it's the second anniversary of the passing of my rabbi and mentor, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. And when I was thinking about this class and the content of this class, I remembered a beautiful kind of eulogy written in the London Jewish News by the older of his two daughters. He had three children, one boy and two girls. Dina Sachs wrote about her father the following, and it's in the handout, and I thought it would be appropriate to read on his yahrzeit on the anniversary of his passing, but it's very much related to this midrash, especially to Abraham. Right? People came and went for meetings, Dina writes, as she remembers her childhood in the home of Rabbi Sachs. They gathered in our living room, eager to hear his words. There was a fervor, a purpose. When he walked fast. We had to run to catch up, physically and figuratively. He was always going somewhere, so to speak, and he was always in a rush, because he was a person who didn't waste time. Dina continues, a couple of years ago, I took my parents to see Hamilton, the musical. I know that Rabbi Sachs adored that musical. He was a massive fan of the United States of America in general. He was a lover of America and American history in particular, and he loved Lin-Manuel's musical adaptation of the life of Alexander Hamilton. And Dina says, I recognize my father in the laser-focused, driven titular role. There's a recurring refrain in Hamilton, in the musical. Why do you write like you're running out of time? Hamilton wrote an extraordinary amount of words, and even have the time to write all that, much in his relatively short life. Well, Rabbi Sachs was similar. The number of books he wrote, the number of articles he wrote, as somebody who tries to write for a living, I just don't know how he did it. His daughter writes, he always knew he was running out of time. He didn't believe that he would live past the age of 40, having had more than one previous brush with death. He battled cancer on 3 separate occasions. The last one obviously was fatal. The first 2 were pretty much kept from the public. People didn't know about it, but he had these brushes with mortality, says Dina. In fact, death was seemingly always in the back of his mind. But that sense of his own mortality led him to extraordinary achievements, because he just didn't waste time. He had, talk about innovative suffering. He suffered terribly from insomnia, which is just horrific thing to suffer from. He just found it terribly difficult to sleep. But what that meant is he was able to read, he averaged reading at least 1 book a day. And the reason he could do that is because he wasn't sleeping. So he used this terrible malady of quite severe insomnia as a spur to further achievement. The other thing I wanted to share with you, the other source I wanted to look at, was the speech of Martin Luther King, the infamous speech of the I Have a Dream speech. And as he looked out on that day from the Lincoln Memorial at the masses of people who had assembled, for this demonstration in favor of civil rights and the emancipation, really, or the fulfillment of the actual promise of emancipation, many years after Lincoln. He looked out at the masses and he said, I'm not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. So there are two things I want to focus on in this quote. One is something with which I want to focus on it, if only to register, in all humility when talking about the words of such a great man, but to register a note of discomfort. And the other issue I want to raise is to tie these words of Martin Luther King back to our Midrash. So the note of discomfort is in the final sentence, that we will continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. So there is a response to the problem of evil. You can find it in some Jewish sources for sure, but it is, I imagine, in a sense, more characteristic of certain Christian sources. It is associated most prominently with a medieval bishop of Lyon called Saint Irenaeus. And it's the view that pain and suffering, whether we deserve it or not, plays an essential role in our maturation. John Hick was an Irenaean theologian of the 20th century. He lived in Birmingham in Britain. He and I think I'm not sure if we'll get back to him in our midrashim on the Parashah. I can't remember if he comes up again. But anyway, he has this view, John Hick, that we are wrong to evaluate God's creation in terms of how comfortable it is to live here. He says that's to treat God as the designer of like a cage for pets. And you're like, well, how comfortable did he make his pets in his cage, right? Is it a nice world to live in? We're his pets, and is he treating us well? John Hick says, no, the point of the creation was in part, or the point of the creation of this world was in part to create an arena in which we human beings could come closer to perfection. We are born as babies, and we go through a process in our lives in which we try to become better and better through self-improvement. And in virtue of that self-improvement, we can earn reward from God, and that's part of why God created us in the first place. So says John Hick, you want to evaluate the creation, don't evaluate it in terms of how comfortable it is to live here. Evaluate it in terms of how good it is at what he calls soul making. How many opportunities does it provide us for growth? And very often the best opportunities for growth, they might well be painful. As C.S. Lewis, another Irenaean theologian, said, pain is God's megaphone to rouse a sleeping world. And then the question is, why doesn't he rouse us with something nicer like violin music or laughter? And C.S. Lewis said, because the dream from which we need to be woken is the dream that all is well. So we can't be woken up with laughter and violins. Pain is the megaphone that calls us to a certain amount of duty. Now, I said that you do get these views in Judaism too. They're often associated with this notion called Yisurin Shel Ahava, that God afflicts people out of his great love for us because somehow the pain is part of a process in which we are made more perfect. Another metaphor that C.S. Lewis used was, we are like blocks of stone out of which the sculptor carves the forms of men. Each blow of the chisel, though it hurts us so much, is part of what makes us perfect. Now, that's what Martin Luther King is drawing from in that last sentence of the excerpt on the handout, when he says, unearned suffering is redemptive. You do find, like I said, such a notion in Judaism, in the concept of Yisurin Shel Ahava. On the other hand, the rabbis were very often uncomfortable with this theodicy. And they said, sure, look, if suffering does come to you, use it as an opportunity for growth if you can. But let's not invite it upon ourselves, right? And Rabbi Yochanan had this phrase, he would say to people, do you want this suffering? Is this suffering chaviv alecha? Is this suffering desired by you? And they would respond to him, no, we don't desire the suffering, and we don't desire the rewards that come with the suffering. And then Rabbi Yochanan would cure them, miraculously from their suffering in the Agadah in the Sechet Brachot. So I'm uncomfortable with this notion that unearned suffering is redemptive, because God forbid it could look like it could lead to a theology in which people almost invite suffering upon themselves. It's not for me to judge. It's not for me to judge the great Martin Luther King. I'm just, like I said, raising a note of discomfort. On the other hand, when suffering does come to you, not that you invited it, when it comes to you, are you able to use it as an opportunity somehow? Are you able, will it crush your faith? And it does crush some people's faith. And I'm not standing in judgment of the people whose faith it crushes. But can you be one of those people who uses suffering as an opportunity for growth, hearing in it a call to action or responsibility? And that's why I said I wanted to focus on a second part of the quote, the part of the quote which I think ties so beautifully to our Midrash, which is when Martin Luther King describes the civil rights activists who are coming from their narrow jail cells, who are coming fresh from the storms of persecution and the winds of police brutality. He describes them as the veterans of creative suffering. And it's that phrase, creative suffering, that I think gets to the heart of what our Midrash is really about. Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were innovators. And Rabbi Levi describes it as Abraham innovated elderliness, Yitzchak innovated frailty, Jacob innovated terminal illness. But if you want to make sense of the Midrash, what's really being said is they were veterans of creative suffering. They didn't ask for these things. Of course they didn't. That's the conceit of the Midrash. But Abraham related to his wrinkles differently to other people. He related to them, he wore them as the battle scars of a life well lived. Isaac viewed his frailty, his elderly frailty, differently to other people. He viewed them as somehow a preparation for the world to come. Jacob viewed his terminal illness differently to other people who had been ill before him, as an opportunity to put things straight before he passed on. In future weeks, I'm just wrapping up now, in future weeks, we're going to use the Midrash to open up the Parashah itself, try and understand deep themes in the Parashah. To some extent, we did that last week. There were many, many themes in the Parashah that we didn't touch on, but in terms of this juxtaposition between Abraham and Lot and the tent of Abraham and the tent of Lot, I felt the Midrash did that. This week, we haven't looked at all really at any of the narrative action of Parashat Hashavuah. Abraham and sending off his servant Eliezer on the quest to find a spouse for Yitzchak. This is more like a midrash that uses a single verse as a peg to say something interesting that's not really about midrash per se. The peg is the description of Abraham's elderliness, and it was. It's my pleasure. Thank you so much, and thank you, Ilana, about my new book. Yes, so this midrash was a midrash that was a peg, but I hope, despite it's not necessarily giving you much to say about the content of the parasha, it gave you a window onto midrash, its humor sometimes, and its bizarreness sometimes, and the depth that you can find, hopefully, beyond it. And I'd like to dedicate this learning to the memory of my rabbi, Rabbi Sachs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Lebens, and thank you to everyone who joined us. We've got a few more minutes. I want to give a little plug to the classes we have coming up, because we've got a lot going on and it's really exciting. We're starting some new cohorts of our skill building shiurim for Mishnah and Talmud that start tomorrow, and they are for all ages. So please check those out and pass them along, because that's a new project of ours that we're very excited about, as well as more classes like this one, which you can find all those things at 5783.drisha.org. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next week and hopefully at more of our classes.